We'll hope for the best and we'll kick off. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on product liability. My name's Heidi Buckingham. I'm a sales and distribution consultant here at Zurich, and I'm joined today by 3 colleagues from Zurich Resilient Solutions, David Moyer, Vicky Gibson and Gillian Watt. I'll hand over to David in just a second, but a little bit of housekeeping first of all. So everyone's on listen only mode at the moment. At the end, we'll have time for questions, so I'll change the settings so you can come off mute and ask a question if you want to. But if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. And you can also pop your questions in the chat at the end as well. As I said, the webinar is being recorded this afternoon, and I will send out a copy of the recording along with the slides to everyone that's attended the session within the next couple of days. There'll also be a feedback questionnaire for topics that you'd like us to talk about in the future, so I'd be really grateful if you could fill that in. And with that, I will hand over to David and we can get going.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today's session on product liability. It's great to see such a good turnout. So just to introduce myself to start with, my name is David Moyer. I'm a senior risk consultant within the liability team at Zurich Resilient Solutions. I've worked for Zurich for 4 years now, and just a bit of my background prior to joining Zurich. During my career, I've worked in liability risk management across a range of sectors, so including roles in the aviation industry, social housing and various sectors of local government. And I started my career working for an enforcing authority in the Environmental Health and Trading Standards Service. So during the past few years in particular, I've worked with a wide range of organisations undertaking reviews of product liability exposures and product liability programmes and quality management systems, and where necessary, identifying areas for improvements in product liability risk controls, including products varying from automotive components to engineering systems to safety critical equipment and devices to food products, and a whole host of other product types in between, and predominantly for organisations with quite complex supply chains as well. So that's me. In terms of the agenda for today, I suppose you could say that product liability is possibly taken on even greater importance in recent months and years due to world events that have impacted on supply chains and potentially had a negative impact on the usual product controls that we would expect to see in place, from semiconductor shortages affecting a range of industries to the pandemic to the war in the Ukraine. Supply chain risks are many and far-reaching at the moment. So for today's agenda, I'm just going to run through some of the key considerations when we talk about product liability. So from a risk consultant's perspective, I'll just give you an insight into some of the key product liability exposures to consider when evaluating products. I'll then move on to run through the types of mitigation that we would expect to see in place in response to those exposures. So from management systems to product testing regimes to quality control. So what essentially makes a good product liability program. I've touched on some of the supply chain challenges that we face there in the current global climate, and I'll cover these in a bit more detail and also run through some of the challenges facing particular industries and potential regulatory developments affecting companies more generally in the UK. And finally, having highlighted product liability exposures, expectations, trends, and so on, I'll talk through some of the services and products that we offer within ZRS that can help customers to understand and where necessary, improve their product safety exposures and management arrangements. So, and then there'll be the opportunity for, as Harry said, for some questions at the end of the session too. So just to kick things off with product liability exposures, and just a quick recap really on what specifically we were talking about when we talk about product liability. So as I'm sure many of you will be aware, product liability is the potential for a product to cause bodily injury, property damage and or financial loss to a third party. So manufacturers, suppliers, designers, retailers clearly have a responsibility to ensure that their products are safe and that they're free from defects and product liability issues. And product liability relates to their legal liability for any losses that their products may cause. And obviously there may be a range of associated costs with product defects, from replacement costs to fines to legal costs. So just taking that a step further and just thinking through a product liability scenario. So we have a manufacturer that produces valves. These are supplied to a client who installs the valves into a chemical plant. So the chemical plant is a third-party operation. Everybody working at the site's third party. So you have your employees, contractors, agency staff, and so on. There's a defect with the batch of valves in question. This leads to a gas leak, resulting in an explosion. So in this scenario, we've got people who have been injured during the explosion. So employees working on site, contractors, visitors. In addition, depending on the magnitude of the explosion, you've got third parties off-site who might also be affected. Neighbouring businesses might be affected. There may be damage to adjacent buildings and property. Financial impacts if the plant's out of operation for a period of time and other businesses in the location affected might also be out of action. So in this scenario, product liability would relate to the fact that the manufacturer in question supplied a defective valve and this resulted in a significant incident causing bodily injury, property damage, financial loss to a range of third parties. And clearly there are a range of mitigation measures that should have been applied to prevent that type of scenario from occurring, and which would be considered as part of any investigation process, and we'll run through what those controls would have been in a bit more detail. So an important element of product liability, and one which I suppose it can sometimes be overlooked, is the need to consider the entire product. It may sound quite an obvious concept, but it's important that we consider the entire product. And what we mean by this is, if we take the example of a company that manufactures, say, microwave ovens, and we asked what the product was in that scenario, of course, people's first thought would be, understandably, the microwave itself is the product. But other key elements of the product, when we consider product liability, would include the packaging. So packaging can obviously have a significant impact on the condition of the product by the time it arrives with the customer. And there may well be specific standards to be applied, for example, in the food industry in relation to packaging. You've also got instructions and warnings. So the manufacturer has a duty to provide instructions for safe usage and any warnings that are required with regards to foreseeable misuse that are appropriate to the product type. You've then got warranties and guarantees. So products with complex warranties and guarantees could potentially increase the exposure as well and need to be considered. Then you've got sales and marketing and advertising as well. So there are safety and liability requirements for advertising materials, marketing materials. So it's important that products aren't oversold, they're not claimed to be the best on the market or suitable for a use which they're not intended. So it's important to really understand the entire product and all of these kind of ancillary product elements if we're to get a true picture as to how product liability is being managed. So when we go on to talk about exposure, product liability exposures, there are a number of factors which potentially can increase the exposure. So if we start with product complexity, as you might expect, the more complex a product is, the more significant the kind of inherent risk with regards to the potential for product failure. So if we think about an electrical component such as a semiconductor and consider this in the context of the product life cycle, the image on the right of the slide there are some quite complex requirements with regards to the design and the manufacture of the product, the testing of the product, and thereafter the warehousing and the logistics before the product actually arrives with the customer. So clearly that complexity increases the risk because there's more potential essentially for something to go wrong. The product range, clearly it's much easier to be a specialist in one type of product than in a range of products. So where there's a large range of products, again, this can change the exposure as it can be more difficult to manage product safety across a range of very different products. That's not to say it can't be done, but it's more of a challenge potentially. Emerging technologies, another factor that we would consider to potentially increase the exposure. So there's a number of reasons for this, really. By the very nature of emerging technology, there's limited experience of a product and the potential issues that could arise once it's in wider use. So compared to technology that's quite well established and has been around for a long time, the inherent risk for emerging technology would be considered to be higher. And therefore there would be the need for enhanced checks to confirm that the required controls are in place. Another factor would be the function of the product. So clearly this is something which has a direct impact on the inherent risks. So safety critical products are always going to carry an increased risk because of the failure of the product can lead to serious consequences. So some examples of products which would have that higher inherent risk because of the function of the product might include medical devices such as a pacemaker or a braking system within a vehicle. Failure of those types of products can lead to serious injury or death. And when you compare it to, say, an office printer, that would obviously have a lower inherent risk because was it to fail, then and the main issue is that it's not going to work rather than causing injury in most circumstances. The geographical spread of a product is another key aspect that we would consider as affecting the exposure. So the main reason for that relates to the challenge of managing the product when it moves across different countries. So it may be supplied to countries that are particularly litigious, such as the US. And there may be cultural and language barriers that also have to be factored in when introducing a product into a particular country or region. And that doesn't just apply to the finished product as well. It's also a major consideration with regard to when we talk about the supply chain as well. The more complex and spread out the supply chain is across the globe, the more challenging it is to manage potentially. And again, that's not to say that that can't be managed effectively across multiple regions. It's just that it's more complex and challenging, and therefore one which carries with it more risk. Mass production, another factor which can increase the risk. So if we take the food industry as an example, any mass produced item which has a risk of contamination in the food, in the production process, failures in the product safety and quality controls could potentially lead to many thousands of defective products going out into the market. So essentially the risk posed by the defective products would be multiplied because they're produced on a mass scale, and potentially more people could then be put at risk if something was to go wrong. The end user is obviously another key consideration. So if a product's being sold into an industry for use by trained, competent individuals, engineers, and so on, then it may well be a safety critical product, but from an end use perspective, you might be reasonably confident that the risk would be controlled. If the product, however, is supplied to the general population, there are a range of other factors that would need to be considered. For example, the product might be used by vulnerable persons, the elderly, children, disabled persons who might be at increased risk, and therefore that obviously needs to be taken into account when designing safety features. And then finally, in terms of factors potentially increasing exposure, you've got the product life cycle. So where you've got extended product life cycles, that can potentially increase the exposure. So it's a fairly straightforward concept in that the longer the product's in use, the more potential there is for failure to occur. So vehicles, for example, might be used for many years compared to food products, which are in the chain of commerce for a much shorter period of time. And for certain industries, you might also have you need to consider the product life cycle right up to the point of final disposal. So, for example, cradle to grave policies in the chemical industry. So once the product's reach the end of its normal use, what would then the disposal requirements be, and what are the arrangements and instructions in place for that? So having considered the product liability exposures and the factors that might increase the risk, I'll just run through now some of the key controls that we'd normally look for to provide assurance that a company is actually managing its product's risks effectively. So the first thing I'll be looking for is management commitment. So there should be a formal, structured product liability program in place. And similar to the approach that we'd be looking for when reviewing an organisation's health and safety arrangements. You'd expect there to be a strategic senior management level commitment to product liability with a formal policy that identifies the key roles, responsibilities, arrangements, and that should be subject to regular review. ISO 9001 often held up as a product liability program, which isn't necessarily the case. Yes, it's an indicator that there's a quality management system in place, and it provides assurances in that respect that that quality management arrangements should be well embedded and consistent. However, an effective product liability program should be broader than that and should consider more than just the quality management aspects. Again, similar to the approach in health and safety management, there should be an appointed competent person to oversee the product liability program. So occasionally companies will say that their health and safety competent person covers product liability as well, but it's that consideration as to whether they're the most appropriate person to have oversight of product liability arrangements, particularly for larger organisations. You'd expect there to be a dedicated resource for product liability. And when we talk about an appointed person, it's important to consider that that person must retain oversight across all aspects of the operation. So when I mentioned earlier the core product versus the entire product, that appointed person, and indeed the product liability program as a whole, should have oversight of not just quality management arrangements in, say, the production environment, but also the packaging, the warnings, the warranties, the sales, the marketing, and so on. And the same is true of the product life cycle. So if you think back to the image on the previous slide, all aspects of the product life cycle must be considered from design through to the end of life of the product. And of course, as with any liability exposure, you'd be looking at the organisation's experience, the track record in terms of product issues and losses. They would be key elements to consider when evaluating the controls that are in place. Other key controls include the business's product knowledge and expertise. So how much experience does a company actually have in the products that they're manufacturing or supplying? So this can potentially be a risk where product lines are constantly changing. It means there's less experience in certain types of product. There have also been situations where organisations will decide to move into new product areas to meet particular trends. So, for example, moving into EV battery production to meet the anticipated increase in the number of electric vehicles on the road. And whilst this kind of change in products, again, it can be managed effectively. If you think back to the exposures that I touched on earlier, so product complexity, emerging technology, it does potentially change the exposure. And if you remember, advanced products, emerging technologies, they are inherently potentially a riskier proposition that requires careful management. Certain industries, automotive, mobile phones, they evolve at a very fast pace, whereas others are more static and more stable. So when we consider product complexity, this will obviously have a bearing on the scale of the technical design management and research and development that's required during the pre-production phase. So where you have the kind of safety critical, the highly complex types of product that I mentioned earlier. So for example, your medical devices, your automotive braking systems, there'll be clear and rigorous requirements for undertaking safety design reviews that are subject to approval throughout the design process. So there'll be the need for a range of controls from your feasibility studies through to field testing, stress testing, product registration and certification. So it's important to understand a company's approach to technical design management and R&D processes and how those are actually being controlled, and they should be appropriate to the product complexity and its end use. From a product testing perspective, the product needs to be tested to ensure that it's safe for the range of environments in which it could be used. And then there's also the requirement to take into account foreseeable misuse. So there isn't the expectation that every every type of misuse has to be covered and protected against. But if we take baby toys, for example, failure to consider choking hazards due to product misuse would be a pretty big failure in the design process. And it should be remembered that labels and warnings as well, they're not a substitute for poor design. So the first consideration should always be, how can a hazard be designed out? So once we've gone through the various product design and testing processes, we then move on to consideration of the actual manufacturing of the product. So good product design doesn't necessarily mean good product manufacturing. It may be that the product design is owned by someone else. However, it's essential that the product is manufactured as per the design, as failure to do so could obviously result in liability. And when I talked about the geographical spread earlier in the manufacturing process, that's an area where potentially this is commonly a factor. So you might have manufacturing facilities across different regions around the globe, and the challenge is then making sure that the standardization of procedures, consistency in the manufacturing process, product changes can obviously be a challenge. So where that is the case, those changes need to be embedded across those different manufacturing locations. And also there might be products with particular sensitivity that could be affected by adverse conditions in the manufacturing environment, and that would all need to be managed. So food, medical devices, electronics, just a few examples there of sensitive products that need to be managed very carefully from a manufacturing perspective. So key questions, I suppose, to consider when thinking about the manufacturing process are: one, first of all, where are the products actually manufactured and who by? Are they manufactured by the insured, or is it outsourced? If they are manufacturing products, how's quality ensured? Sorry. And three, is the product particularly sensitive to the manufacturing environment? And from a supply chain perspective, it may be that, well, there may be a range of materials and services that are procured from third parties. So this can range from raw materials to equipment parts to components to IT to engineering support. The list could go on. Indeed, the manufacturing process as a whole may be outsourced, but it's important to understand the activities that are outsourced. If they're not managed correctly, that can increase the exposure. So in terms of controls, there should be robust supplier selection processes in place, arrangements for auditing and inspecting suppliers, reviewing performance, and confirming that the quality of the product is as expected. Again, going back to that point on considering the entire product, this is where packaging and labeling controls would come in. So packaging has a number of functions in that it identifies the product, it helps to protect it and maintain the quality. And it's essentially the element that follows the manufacturing process and ends up with your finished packaged good. So that's quite a key consideration as well. And then what are the controls for onward distribution of the product? Who manages that? If it's a third party, similar to the earlier points on outsourcing, how are they vetted? How are they monitored? And are there any special storage and transportation requirements? So quality management, clearly this is a really important part of managing product liability exposures. So it's all about making sure that there's that consistency throughout, making sure that any deviations from the quality standards that have been set, that they're identified internally and rectified. So because basically if there's any failure in these systems, quality management systems, it would mean that an organisation was instead reliant on such issues being reported by consumers upon receipt of products, or even worse, once a product quality issue had led to an incident. So essentially, you're looking for that proactive approach versus a reactive approach. We touched on ISO 9001 earlier. Obviously, that certification provides some assurances that a consistent approach to quality management is being implemented. And we'd be looking for confirmation that that quality management system covers the entire process. So on the next slide, I just wanted to cover some of the kind of current trends and the potential emerging risks that could affect the world of product liability and product safety. It's fair to say that in recent months and years we've been through one of the most turbulent periods, I suppose, in history for global supply chains, and this has obviously had a huge impact on product manufacturers. And coupled with this, the technology used in products is changing, and we're also seeing the economy become more and more digitalized as well. So various changes have been proposed to the regulatory framework affecting product liability and safety to try and keep pace with these technological advances that are happening. So in the EU, there's changes from the General Product Safety Directive to the General Product Safety Regulation that are going through the approval process at the moment, and there's a focus there on improvements in cybersecurity, online marketplaces, and then emerging technologies such as AI and connected products. In the UK, there are also moves to strengthen the existing framework with a particular focus on new technology and online sales, as the regulatory framework tries to keep pace with the technological advances that are happening. The EU is also proposing to reform the product liability directive so that it's more appropriate for the digital age and the increased use of artificial intelligence. And in the UK, there's also a review of the Consumer Protection Act with a similar aim, really, of making it more suitable for these developments in technology. So all of these regulatory reviews are ongoing, but they're likely to have a significant impact in the areas of product liability and product safety, and definitely ones to watch in terms of the potential impact on clients. In the automotive industry, we've seen significant fast-paced developments in recent years in autonomous technology, automated driving systems, and earlier I mentioned the increased risk posed by complex products and emerging technology. The types of interconnected systems present in new types of automotive are a case in point with regard to that. So that increase in connected and automated systems and software obviously brings with it the potential for cyber attacks. The regulatory framework in the UK and the EU is currently under review to ensure that it's suitable for this increased use, the wide-scale use potentially, and the safe operation of autonomous vehicles. Sticking with that theme of cybersecurity, there's a whole host of products that now present increased cybersecurity risks due to the new connected technology that they incorporate. So from medical devices to virtual reality headsets. In the UK, the Product Safety and Telecommunications Infrastructure Bill, that's introduced proposals for substantial penalties for companies that fail to protect connected consumer devices from cyber attacks. So that, again, that's something that's going through the various readings at the moment, with a view to coming into law. PFAS. So again, this is another emerging risk from a litigation perspective. So you may well have seen articles regarding recent legal developments concerning man-made forever chemicals, as they're known, which are found in a range of consumer products and are potentially harmful both to health and to the environment. Again, this is an area in which the regulatory landscape's evolving in response to ongoing studies into the impacts of these chemicals. But for businesses operating in industries where this could be an exposure, I'd be looking for assurances that as part of the product liability regime, there are policies and procedures in place to ensure that only safe and sustainable chemicals are used. And then with regards to supply chain, we've got obviously the impacts of recent world events, in particular the pandemic, the war in the Ukraine. They've affected many aspects of the global supply chain. So from logistics disruption to production delays to impacts on the supply of commodities. Many businesses have been significantly impacted. It's likely that these impacts will continue in the coming months and years. And due to the complex international nature now of many food supply chains, as I mentioned earlier, the geographical spread presents an inherent risk that's impacted many. So these kind of impacts, they can have a real, they present a real challenge for organisations, particularly ensuring the quality management standards that we've run through during the presentation, and supply chain visibility as well. It presents real challenges in making sure that like those standards, that visibility are maintained when changes have to be made within the supply chain. So from a product liability perspective, it's really important that businesses continue to maintain the same standards of supply chain management in these turbulent times. So those are just some of the key trends and emerging risks. And then finally, I just wanted to before we move on to questions, I just wanted to highlight some of the products and services that Zurich Resilience Solutions are able to deliver to support customers in their management of product liability exposures and associated risks. So we offer a product liability assessment for customers. So the purpose of this type of assessment is to help businesses understand the potential injury and material damage risks arising from products, and then to review the control arrangements that are in place to mitigate those risks. So we'll be really getting into the detail of the types of risk factors that I've run through in the slides there, looking in detail all stages of the production process, from design, pre-production, through to production and post-production, and recall arrangements, just to understand how well those product risks are being managed, and then to put forward, if necessary, risk improvement actions, and provide guidance as to where things could potentially be improved. So this will normally involve a visit to, well, it can either be done virtually or on site, a review of customer controls, policies, procedures, and so on, and then a report will be produced at the end of the process with commentary on what's been done well, from all the positives, and then any potential areas for improvement, and suggestions as to how any potential gaps in arrangements could be addressed. So that's one service that we offer. We also offer product liability awareness training. So this is a half-day course where we go into a lot more detail on product-related risks, exposures, and the management systems and procedures that we would expect to see in place to control those risks. So there's a number of exercises as part of this course. We try and keep it quite interactive. And the benefits of this is, obviously it gives organisations that insight into product liability considerations, again at all stages through the production process, and also again practical ideas as to how product liability controls can be enhanced from a claims defensibility perspective. And then just moving on to a couple of other offerings that we have around supply chain risk. Specifically, we have a supply chain specialist who has developed a range of offerings around supply chain propositions. So from supply chain risk assessments to risk assessment of critical suppliers, loss scenario workshops, and other supply chain risk management services powered by artificial intelligence. So there's a partnership with a software provider that helps to review the supply network and make sure that that's as resilient as it can be. So we've got offerings which also look specifically at supply chain risks. And then finally, when we talked about emerging risks there are obviously a lot of links with cybersecurity. So again, we have cyber risk specialists who offer a range of support services, from cyber health checks to incident response exercises. So looking at how well developed the kind of crisis management piece is from a cyber resilience perspective. Managed security services, and then bespoke consultancy services around cyber as well. So they're just a few of the risk management services that we can offer in the area of product liability and associated risks. And then finally, just a couple of products that we have as well. to provide support in the area of product liability. So Zurich Risk Advisor is a free app. So this is basically this is available to, it's not just restricted to Zurich customers, it's available to everybody. So it's available on both iOS and Android. It can be downloaded free of charge, sorry, for you to use. And then it has a number of risk snapshots, of which one is product liability. So a risk snapshot is quite a short self-assessment process that customers can use, suited to any size of organisation. It just gives them a basic introduction to product liability. It should take around about 15 minutes to complete all sections of the risk snapshot. As you go through it, as the customer goes through the process, it gives advice if there are any negative responses as to how they might think about addressing that, and how we would normally recommend that particular issue would be improved. There's no restrictions in terms of access to use that tool, and reports can be generated with risk improvements in that can be then used to follow through any actions that are generated from the risk snapshot process. And that the risk snapshot is based on the ZRS risk grading standards that we utilise when we go out and undertake product liability gradings. So there are a couple. That's an example of some of the products that we have, and that brings me to the end of the slides that I wanted to run through. So I'll just throw it open now to for any questions.
Thank you very much, David. It was a brilliant session. I will just change the settings, so if you want to come off mute and ask any questions, you can, but feel free to put any questions in the chat in the meantime. Question from Sam. Are accreditations globally recognised, e.g. ABC Limited uses two manufacturers, one based in India and one based in France? Could the same accreditation be relevant for both?
Yeah, so when I mentioned ISO certification, that is a globally recognised standard. So yes, that would be recognised globally. Yes.
Thanks, David. Any other questions? Not seen any come in just yet, but I'll give it a minute or so. Oh yeah, I've got a question from Caroline. Hi, would you be able to give a claims talk at another time, showing complex cases and show where the liability in the chain ended up, and some that were declined?
Yeah, I'm sure that could be arranged. Yeah, we could look at that sort of session, and also on the product liability the half-day session that I mentioned. That's something that we include within the content. There is some examples of product liability claims, just following those through from the incident through to how it panned out in terms of defensibility and liability and so on.
Question from Johnny. Does branding/rebranding have an effect on product liability for retailers and suppliers, or would the manufacturer still be held responsible for defects, for example?
I mean, essentially, the manufacturer. Well, if the manufacturer has designed the product, then they own the design. So, but potentially there are exposures there from a rebranding perspective as well, and it would be important to look at that from a contractual perspective as to what the contractual arrangements are in relation to rebranding and the protection that's in place as well from a liability perspective.
David? Can you give PL advice at design stage, or does it need to be in production?
No, as I mentioned in the slides, it should cover the full extent of the process when we're considering product liability exposures. So it should very much be a consideration of from design, pre-production, production through to post-production. So from a product liability perspective, we're considering all stages of the process.
Okay. Another question, would you offer run-off products cover if a partnership split off and liabilities weren't transferred?
Ooh, that's probably question on cover is probably more suited for underwriting, I would say, but that's possibly one to take away and see if I can get a response to that for you.
Problem.